You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Farhad. Hope you are all doing well. We have a very special guest joining us today, my friend Jin Kim. How are you today, Jin?
Hey, Farad, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. As with all of our other guests, it would take way too long to go through Jin's background and accomplishments. So I'm just going to highlight two specific things. First, he was with the FBI, where he spent over 23 years and ultimately became a subject matter expert on active shooters, which is what we're going to talk about today. And once he left, he started his own consulting firm, Persec Academy and Advisory Group, which helps organizations on a number of different security related issues. I reached out to Jin and asked him to be on our show today to help us address a topic that he is all too familiar with. And I'm going to use a name that he dubbed in an article he wrote a few years ago, the age of the active shooter. Mass shootings, obviously, as we all know, have become a prevalent part of our society. There have been so many that have occurred recently, and we wanted to put some information out there from a real, true expert. Jin actually, just to follow up on that particular article, you wrote that a couple of years ago, and not sure where you'd envision we'd be today. Do you think we've made any progress?
That's a great question, Farhad, and I'm sure that you and your audience probably have a good appreciation for how complex this phenomena that we're experiencing for well over 50 years in this country. This is definitively an American problem and will always remain an American problem. And I wrote that a couple of years ago, as you had mentioned, after a brutal, time in our country of a summer where, if you can recall, the Garlic Festival in California in July, and then we had the Walmart, Texas event in that summer, followed by the Dayton, Ohio historic visitors attack, the mobile assault, in Odessa, Texas, and then, finally the Saugus High School shooting where that offender, in a high school came up and shot 5 other people right before school started. So, at that time, like many others, there was a sense of frustration that I felt, and I felt that I needed to pen something, and it was, unfortunately, still holds true today, as you had mentioned. I firmly believe that this generation and we here are living in an unprecedented time, and we need to really, really try to find and cultivate, solutions because, one of the underlying themes was just, redefining insanity. And everyone might know that Einstein penned the quote, the definition of an insanity is doing something over and over and over again and expecting different results. And I feel that that's exactly where we're stuck. We are stuck in a circle, in a loop of just insanity, having the same conversations over and over and over again, and not getting anything substantively or tangibly done. And that's very, marketable and measured in the people that, unfortunately were tragically killed just recently in multiple events we had. So, this thing here, and I wish I could put a yes or a no, but frankly, it's kind of like deterrence. It's very, very difficult to measure and quantify. So have we made any gains, any progress? Sadly, I don't think we have up until this point. And my hope is that we can start a dialogue and, really try to find solutions. But what I understand and how I understand and being in this space for as long as I have, it's not going to be easy as time is, has told. because frankly, we're going to need things that that are going to make people uncomfortable, like time and money and compromise. And those are things that I'm not sure we're postured to do, because clearly we haven't since I penned that article.
Sure, sure. That's interesting. Before I guess we get into the questions for this podcast, maybe you can provide some insight as far as, how you sort of became a subject matter expert with the FBI. What sort of, I guess, made it interesting to you? How did you become knowledgeable about it? So that way our audience could get a true feel, because I think this is important because, again, I certainly feel very strongly about your qualifications to talk about this particular topic, but I'd love to, especially for those people that may not know you, which a lot of them will, to give them a little bit of flavor on your background.
Yeah, sure. So my introduction into the active shooter space, like many others back in 1999, was based on Columbine and how law enforcement in general flexed and pivoted and responded in changing a lot of protocols, procedures, and tactics. So as a young SWAT operator, that had instant impact on how we did business, our ability to respond. For all of that time leading up to Sandy Hook, after the Sandy Hook event, the president, through executive action, went ahead and got the FBI involved in this to be a resource to the community, to the public, and that is when my journey started. And there is no formal process in becoming an SME. You kind of just develop it, and that's how it all progressed. And I got my marching orders, and I ran with it. And unfortunately, since then, it's spending pretty much every day in this space, analyzing and trying to be and continue to be that that public resource, and carrying that mission on is what I feel like I've been doing up until now.
Sure, sure. So as you mentioned, this is obviously a very, very complex topic. So for the purposes of this show, we're not going to try to address every single aspect of it. So if it's okay with you, Jin, I'd like to just kind of ask you some questions that I know our listeners and many people out there are curious about. So to start with,
Sure.
everyone is always looking for a checklist of things to look out for, things to do, etc. What are some broad level things that organizations should be thinking about in terms of preparing for an active shooter situation?
Yeah, great question. And in my experience with the FBI and as a consultant and practitioner in this space in the private sector, I feel I've definitely seen my share. One thing that I personally believe to be the top of that list is acceptance. And what I mean by acceptance is this: we still have a very large portion of our country that does not believe that they or their people or their institution can be affected by an event like this. And what happens is, after you interview someone and they survive an event like this, and you sit them down and you ask what happened, and they're obviously traumatized, there are some really common things that come out of people's mouths immediately. And some of those examples are, number one, I never thought it would happen to me, here, or to us. And second, I had no idea what was going on. And things like that, where people aren't privy to, and because some of this stuff really is esoteric, and I know your audience can appreciate this, but a lot of what I know is guided by what happened and how people responded, from that event and events collectively. So collecting a lot of this data and a lot of this information, to me is where, the rubber meets the road and where we need to find solutions and kind of focus in on. So acceptance for an organization really truly is the biggest hurdle, I believe, in the organization, even when they're even considering implementing some type of procedure or protocol or preparedness level. Because most often you hear the C-suite say, well, I don't want to, scare our employees or our population or a community. And frankly, most people are completely aware of this threat and this risk that they have, and frankly, want, their institutions to address it and give some guidelines and things to prepare them at least, within their mind and their mindset. And so, when you look back and, a lot of the conversations I've had to do with really trying to relate and communicate, to the C-suite and that executive level in that boardroom on why they need to and the responsibilities and duties of care that come along with that. It's not the director of security or the risk manager that needs to be convinced. It's those
Sure.
up there, because it's much easier to implement and to push out preparedness that is related to modern day risk that can affect anyone 24/7, no matter where they are or what they're doing in this country. So it's much easier to implement that from the top down rather than it is from the lower and push it back up, because the need is there and the want is there, and it's clear. And I'm sure, again, your audience knows and understands this just as well. As far as the other stuff in the checklist, it really depends on, the structure of the organization and, because there are different challenges between an office environment and a school environment to a manufacturing environment to, agriculture, indoor, outdoor. There's just a lot of considerations to really, really delve into. But, prioritizing, what's important within an institution is very telling, because I've asked a lot of executives and people, in the past, in these high level meetings, what's your greatest asset in this company? And frankly, if they don't say it's our people or our human capital, then I know there's a disconnect. And that's, something very telling within that institution and that culture. And most will say it's our people. They're the most important thing. So to me, empowering your workforce and your employees and or your students, staff, and faculty, through understanding and even just moving the needle a little bit, as an institution, is going to make, marketable and considerable differences in people's lives. Again, 24/7, 365, no matter where and how they are. So, without going into, really specifics, because we could talk about this for, hours and days on end, those two factors are really the driving factors. I think the biggest challenges that any, risk manager or security director will probably find.
It's interesting, the acceptance component of what a lot of risk management and preparedness, regardless of the type of emergency that might occur, does ultimately boil down to accepting, right, that it could happen to you. And while people accept everyday things, a power outage, bad weather, intruders, things like that, big events like this, you're right. I mean, a lot of people, while they don't want it to happen, and they certainly want to show that they're thinking about it and preparing for to some extent, I still think even us to some extent, you don't ever really believe that it could happen to you, but it's important that you accept it. And then the rest of kind of what you're saying, I mean, prioritize, assess your risk based on the type of organization you are and what other risks are on the spectrum, and make sure that not only you have things in place, but that you're getting the information out there to the people that are associated with your organization. So all really good points, Jin. So what are the signs to look out for? What are strong indicators on individuals? Is there any insight that you could offer about that?
Yeah, there is. And, if you think about all of the research and the data that's been collected over the last 5, 10, 15 years, there's been a tremendous amount of research from the private sector and even the public sector that's gone into this, unfortunately. So, when you take a look and you break down an incident and this social, epidemic that we have and criminal epidemic that we have, uh, there's some glaring truths to this and the process. And the thing is, we know the process. We understand, from a profession and an industry that, there's a certain, we call it the pathway of violence, that these offenders, this population within the broader population that's frankly probably growing every single day, that these offenders go through, and some the most glaring stuff, if you look back at the data, is concerning behavior. And what I mean by that is the vast majority of these offenders go through a process, and at one point, even after the event, and we go back and we investigate and we do all of the response and recovery, that the vast majority of them communicate in one way, shape, form, or another their intention or their grievance. And there are people, to at least one person in their life close to them, and that's a considerable indicator to try to get ahead of and to try to intercede in that process. And some of that concerning behavior, when we look back, can be expressed either verbally to them or physically in their written word in print and or through their social media. And what I mean by concerning behavior is something that's off their baseline. Because remember, these things that they say and do, to people that are close to them, everyone kind of knows everyone's baseline. If you spend, a lot of time with someone, you understand everyone's baseline. I'm not talking about someone having a bad day, but I'm talking about a very noticeable long-term spiral in the core of who they are, and they come off of that baseline. And that's really where, things become very, very dangerous, and that potential offender, now becomes at risk. And that's where I firmly believe a lot of our efforts really need to focus in on, because we really got good as public responders to preparing, to responding, and unfortunately to recovering from these events. But, when you look at the basic crisis management, model, prevention is the first step. And we're not ignoring that, but I don't think we're getting enough resources into that first initial step. So those indicators are really based on that behavior that's very, very telling when someone starts coming off their baseline. And remember, Farhad, these events, these are just not acute events where someone just wakes up and says, you know what, today I feel like going to the supermarket and shooting the place up. No,
Right.
These are not them. These are very slow burn events, and there's a tremendous amount of preparedness and preparation and planning that go into these events. And yeah, we know that, and most of these times that, firearms are then purchased if they don't have one, and or there is a relationship to acquiring that firearm. And if they don't have one and they can't get one legally, guess what they're going to do? They'll probably try to get one unlawfully, or skirt whatever laws and or loopholes that are currently out there when it comes to firearms. So those are probably the biggest points when it comes to indicators and what these offenders show and how they show it.
Sure. No, very interesting points. And it always feels like afterwards, like you talk about a post-incident investigation, as law enforcement and others talk to different people that were involved in the incident, or people that know the perpetrator, it always seems like people end up knowing, and either they report it or aren't really strong about, really following up with it and things like that. So I think one really important thing that would be critical to address in our conversation is, what if, regardless of what role you play in an organization, in society, or whatever the case is, if you notice something, that baseline, that I think that's a really good way of kind of helping people understand it. If you notice concerning behavior outside of that baseline, that normal baseline that just is concerning, what do you do? Can you talk a little bit about what you would recommend someone do, and how much follow up, and what are the steps that they should take?
Yeah, a great point, because when you look at this, and I don't want your audience to mistake that, again, people going through a tough time in their life, or
Sure.
they're suffering through some type of life stress, and we all at one point or another probably have that in our lives. This is something very different, because people want to know why. Well, what happens is a grievance develops inside of this offender's mind and their psyche, and they're under most all of them exhibit and are subjected to stressors. And what I mean by stressors, that the vast majority of these offenders had stressors in their life at the time of the attack, and some of the cause of these stressors were personal loss and or like financial instability or loss, kind of getting fired or losing their ability to to sustain their financial living, a political agenda, and sometimes it's just regular bullying in the workplace or in schools that just over time just builds and builds and builds. And unfortunately, these events, they unfortunately end in tragedy, and the offender unfortunately knows that this is only going to end in a couple of ways, and that is by their suicide, or by their apprehension by law enforcement, or they're going to lose a gunfight to law enforcement. But what happens in their lives and their desire, they're consumed by this grievance, that they need to, excise this grievance, and it manifests into the violence. And unfortunately, they know this, but it's just so consuming to them, and it overpowers them. And to me, I believe that's when that disconnect happens, where they just disconnect from the rest of us, and again, it results in violence. And it's really hard to kind of conceptualize or quantify, hey, when should you report something to someone because I'm concerned? Well, first,
Right.
being concerned, and you identify that, someone that maybe you spend a lot of time with and or daily, coming off that baseline, it could very well be, hey, starting to have that conversation and that outreach, to me, can't hurt. So if it goes beyond that, and now you start to see maybe some tendencies that make you feel very uncomfortable, that's really underlying in violence, then maybe in the workplace, it's time to have a conversation or make that contact with and go up the chain, and unfortunately, especially HR departments, have to have a process in place to try to help and intervene early and often. And how that happens, where it happens, is really based on how postured that HR is and committed to it. Because frankly, when you look at HR departments across the board, most are just there to serve and be transactional, meaning they're there just to administer regular HR stuff. And most to these days, even big companies, are not postured to help with things like this, and that's why some of this, again, prevention is where we need to really work on moving forward. So communicating this to those and making people aware, it's the key. And obviously, we've had examples of, family members calling 911, and
Yep.
that's happened, and it will continue to happen. So, and they've been able to avert violence like that. And now, there's examples now where you see red flag laws or emergency, orders, red flag orders, becoming more significant and playing a role in, having at-risk people addressed by the court.
Sure, sure. I think your clarification and sort of addressing the fact that there is a very, very delicate balance here, and kind of again clarifying this is not just having someone having a bad day. This is something more than that, and there is a very delicate balance in terms of, okay, is this just a bad day kind of thing? And look, everyone's not an expert, so it's your perception of it sometimes. And I think the point about organizations, again, accepting, like you mentioned, learning to deal with it, having some sort of process in place to address it, and then ultimately it's helping people, right? It's helping not only the person reporting, but possibly the person that is being reported, to help them hopefully come out of that sort of dark space, or if not, taking the necessary steps to prevent something really tragic from happening. So that's a good clarification. So this leads into the question about, there are so many reports, I imagine, to not only local police departments, but the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, about people being concerned about behavior of an individual or a group of individuals, right? So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is it something from a law enforcement perspective that we're getting better at, and sort of triaging and figuring out, how do we deploy the resources properly?
Yeah, and that's kind of, where I think our solution has to start. Is there's a big gap in what, the public expects law enforcement, how they respond and where and who they respond to. Obviously, they're going to respond to any call of service, but, frankly, law enforcement is not in general geared to deal with, mental health issues when they arrive on scene, and maybe there's, an emotional or behavioral component to, someone that they're responding to. And do I think that law enforcement in general can benefit from that? Absolutely, without a doubt, because it's a component. Mental wellness and mental health has been and will probably always be, unfortunately, one of the factors of why this happens. But, and there's another, and that's another misunderstanding, because when we look at the numbers and the data points, that most people would just assume that this person or an offender has completely lost their mind and is completely, emotionally lost, and has mental health issues. But that's not the case. We see the vast majority of offenders are not, and those that are, and the number varies based on who you ask, what data that you look at, but it's as low as 15, maybe 20% that had some underlying mental health issue, but a lot of that issue was not relatable to violence. Or commensurate to violence, and that's something that's glaring to me when we look at the mental health component of this. So that gap, unfortunately, we need to fill that gap. We have armies of social workers and psychologists and threat assessors that we need to start now bringing to the table and forming up, part of this solution, because that intervention, to me, moving forward, is a key component on how we address this, and we make a marketable progress into trying to cull and to mitigate and to lessen the effect it has on the public and our citizenry, because frankly, I don't think we'll ever be able to solve this problem, especially in our lifetime, but we can certainly make a difference moving forward by, not thinking and having the same conversations over and over and over again, for the last couple of decades.
Sure. No, I agree with you, and hopefully, again, this discussion, others, will help kind of move that needle a little bit. So, what we usually try to do, Jen, is at the end, talk about what are the takeaways from this episode. First of all, again, we just got to scratch the surface, but I wanted to address kind of what I know our audience and others are asking about. And certainly we can connect with people offline to discuss this further. But the question I have for you is from a corporate standpoint. You addressed sort of the law enforcement government side of things, but from a corporate perspective, if you had to just address a couple of takeaways from our discussion today and what you know about, what would you say to people listening that are responsible for people, corporations, properties, things like that, that you would want the takeaway to be from listening to this episode?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Top takeaway, without a doubt, is make an investment in what you value the most in your institution, and that's your people. Because if there's anything that you can do, outside of the scope and mission of the institution, is make an investment, a real true investment into your human capital, and really address and prepare for violence like this that may enter someone's life, anytime and any place, 24/7. That includes there at work or your institution, and then even outside of it. Because you really think about this is something that a lot of people and corporations think, well, it could never happen to us here at our workplace, and that's just, I think there's an arrogance to that and a deep misunderstanding, because people actually think they have control over things that they don't. So this is an investment in people and value and really having and upholding that responsibility of duty of care.
Sure. No, I think that's a fantastic way to end the episode, and I 100% agree with you, and appreciate you joining me for this episode. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. Please continue to send your questions and comments. Let us know if there's a topic you want us to address or a person you would like to hear from. As usual, you could reach us through info@integrusintel.com. We'll also put a link to Jin's LinkedIn profile in the description. Feel free to reach out to him directly and connect with him, or let us know and we'll help you get connected. Jin, thank you so much for joining today and participating in this discussion. Again, you're a true expert in this field and so knowledgeable about the topic that we discussed, and I hope people take advantage of having you as a resource to further their organization in preparedness and response to these kind of incidents. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Farad.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.